So we are in the middle of a plastic pollution crisis, and the government announced plans to introduce a virgin plastic tax by 2022. What will be the impact on our environment by not taking action sooner and immediately? In effect, Julian, can I ask you first?
Yeah, thank you. So there are a number of different taxes that would need to be, when we talk about tax on plastics, actually there are so many different products and there are so many different levels of stages in the production of plastic and so on. So a quotes plastic tax would actually need to be a many and varied beast. What we have in the budget is suggestion that there may be a tax on plastic or products that have less than 30% recycled content in them. But that is a just a sort of a notional figure for now, because they will consult on what that is. I'm coming a roundabout way to answer your question, because what we need to do right now is start banning products that are unnecessary, plastic products that are pointless. That there is some talk about with some of those, like plastic stem cotton buds and coffee stirrers and things like that. But that's very, very partial, very, very piecemeal. And I often, when I'm out with my kids on the beach and they're asking for lollipops, and I'm looking around me and there's lollipop sticks all over the floor and on the sand, and they're made of plastic. Why would you ban plastic stem cotton buds but not lollipop sticks, which is exactly the same once they get in the sea? So there's a lot that needs to happen right now that we could and should be doing even before tax.
The answer to that is that the EU is banning them.
Yeah.
So the government has failed to take action, so the EU is banning them, so we're going along with the EU,
well,
as long as we're there.
And Scotland was taking a lead there as well. Yes, absolutely. So you might say it's an open door to walk through in those policy areas, but we need to look at all of the others or the other products as well. We need to look across the board. We need to take a framework approach, essentially, of looking at what are the sources of plastic pollution. They're not just what many of us sort of start and stop with thinking about, which is supermarket packaging and stirrers and things like that. Huge amounts of plastic pollution are coming from car tyres, from the soles of our feet, from the clothes that we wear, all of these different things. And so an approach that focuses on the problem, which is plastic pollution, would look at those different sources and set up a committee. We believe that we should be legislating for a committee that would advise on the best ways of getting rid of plastic pollution from these different sources. And some you can act on very quickly, immediate product bans or immediate taxes and levies and such like, and this committee has proposed one, of course, with the latte levy. Others, car tyres, it will take longer to figure out what to do with those, but we could be innovating, we should be investing, we should be setting ourselves a longer-term target to make sure that we've done away with pollution from those sources. But we are already at. I often talk about that plastic pollution crisis as being very analogous to the climate pollution, the carbon pollution crisis, because there are so many different sources of it, and because we didn't know when we decided that we needed to act on climate change, and when we legislated for it 10 years ago, almost to the week, how to go about it in every sense. But we set up the legislation, we passed the legislation that committed us to the downward trajectory, and we set up the committee that would tell us how to do it. The same applies with plastic, but the key difference between plastic and carbon is that we don't have a sense of what the available plastic budget is. And so when you say what needs to be, what would be done, what would be the impact right now on the environment, or I can't remember exactly how you worded your question, but what would be the precedent?
By delaying, basically, until 2022,
yeah.
What are we missing in the meantime?
It's hard to answer that with a scientific sort of quantifiable sense of what is the available budget that we would be eating into, which we can do with climate. But we know that plastic pollution is getting in right at the bottom of the food chain. Because what happens with larger plastics, which we're familiar with the impacts on wildlife, they get snared in it, they eat it and they starve and that kind of thing, the larger plastics. But they break down into smaller plastics, into microplastics, even nanoplastics.
Yeah, we've done an inquiry into microbeads and in plastic.
So
assume that we know a level, we understand microplastics.
Forgive me, yes. So without going over all of that, I guess the point I was trying to say is that we know that there is a really, really serious risk to not just environment but human health and so on. and therefore, under a precautionary principle approach, we ought to be slamming on the brakes on the release of plastic pollution right now. And every day that we aren't taking that action, we are stacking up the risk to our health and our environment. Okay. It's just hard to know exactly how and why, but we know it's serious.
Thank you. Okay.
Just add to that, I think the step that we could take right now through the resources and waste strategy, as and when it comes out, is to look at how we can put more focus on product design. So how are plastic-based products designed in such a way that they are easier to reuse or recycle? The EU is currently in the process of expanding its EU eco-design regulations, which up until now have just focused on energy efficiency and now are going to focus increasingly on resource efficiency in order to promote the reuse of secondary materials. So I think we should be looking at actually that particular aspect of the plastic strategy in Europe as providing quite an interesting proposal going forward. Another thing the plastic strategy in Europe is looking at, which I think is worthwhile taking on board, is that there's a working committee on standardization and a working committee on chemical contamination, looking at how we can remove some of the barriers to plastic reuse. A lot of the time there is a nervosity on secondary markets that reused plastic will be suitable for reuse, will be good quality, and generally that tends to be linked to concerns around contamination or to varying qualities of plastics. So I think putting more focus in our approach to waste, not only on taxation, but also really looking at the early stages of how you design those things and make sure they are suitable for reuse and recycling would really help pay dividends in the near term. And
that needs complete reform of the waste system at the moment, which you may be aware I have my own backbench bill on, so which is gaining increasing support about reforming all of that and looking at
that's a really important area to look
at. Josh.
Just to add that there are definitions around what becomes a waste after the point it's been used, and that can be often a real barrier to reusing materials. So once an item is put a dump, for example, and it goes in a certain pile, it can't be reused even if it is of a suitable standard. So it's kind of a legal grey area where recyclers are letting people come and take these materials because they can be reused, but technically they're a waste, and then they need to be going through a certain type of process. So there's a bit of work we can. I'm sure if you're aware of this, there's work we can do around what the definitions of waste are to increase the reuse of material. And then the last thing I would say is around the stimulation of secondary markets and getting. I was going to say. Getting recycling rates up.
It's about finding that market. For the recyclers.
Yeah, exactly, and particularly the economics of recycling are so challenging right now that unless we stimulate those secondary markets, then the recycling rates aren't going to increase. So when it comes to deposit return schemes or other things, we might get a greater collection of material, but unless the end use and the secondary markets work economically, then there's no mechanism to deal with that, even if we increase our uptake.
Okay, so can I just move on to a secondary question on that, and how effective do you think this tax is going to be once it's implemented? I mean, there are huge barriers here. It's quite a generic, as you said, it's very broad. There's a lot of detail that needs to be worked out. How effective really is this, or is it just a greenwash?
I think that it would make some contribution, but it would be a very, very small contribution. Let me just set that, please, in the context of, we're talking here about recycling, and when you're talking about reusing plastic, I think even there what you meant was recycling, so the reuse of recycled plastic rather than reusing a product. And the problem with plastic in particular, and this applies to most materials, but plastic in particular, is that recycling is really not the answer to this problem. We're looking at a quadrupling in production of plastic and plastic waste over the next few decades to 2050. And recycling at the moment is only managing about a third, to recover about a third of that. But plastic, you can only recycle it maybe 5-6 times, and then it's ending up in landfill or incineration. And reference my point earlier on about Adair Turner's calculation about the climate impacts of incinerating all of that plastic. So for that and all sorts of other reasons, which include the loss of plastic pollution through abrasion of the product during its life cycle, so recycling won't do anything about car tyres going bald and shedding that plastic and so on. The focus has to be on reduction of the amount of plastic we're using.
Effective was the question.
Yes, and it won't be in that sense, because it can only be a tiny bit effective, because unless you do something about the overall amounts of plastic that we're using, and at the moment business as usual sees a massive increase, a quadrupling plastic production, then recycling a bit of it, it isn't going to help much. It's just going to mean that we might increase the proportion recycled a little bit, but in absolute terms, of course, even more will be getting released into the environment. So no.
Okay. Any other comments on that?
I still think it's compared to the status quo, it's a helpful contribution. Although exactly how it's going to work on the ground depends on what is actually proposed in the consultation. So it's hard to comment on that without seeing the consultation. But clearly, on its own, it's not going to be enough. And I mean, that's the whole point for why we need a comprehensive resources and waste strategy, is to really being able to look at how do we do things better in terms of how we design things, and how do we do things better in terms of how we stimulate demand for more resource-efficient products, including products that move away from using particular types of materials where those actually create a sort of long-term waste issue.
Okay. We're going to move things along, because I'm slightly concerned we're going to have a vote. So apologies if we have to run out. Caroline.
Sorry, yes, very quickly. I wanted to ask a question to Josh and Nick about the carbon price support scheme, which has been a key factor in reducing the UK's reliance on coal. The government said it's going to, or at least it's looking at, reducing the carbon price support after 2020.